Hi, I'm Paul Battaglia, and this is section 1.9, Inverse Functions. Today I'm joined by Brittany and Gabe, who are going to talk to us a little bit more about inverse functions and the things that we need to teach our students to look out for as well as execute. How are you guys today?
Doing well. How are you?
Good. Who wants to start us off?
I guess I'll start us off. So going into this section, inverse functions, I think students have sort of an idea as to what I mean when I say an inverse function. So if I give them something like, oh, let's start with x. If I add 4 to x, how do I undo this operation? I subtract 4. If I multiply x by 2, how do I undo this operation? I divide by 2. So they sort of have this notion as to what I mean when I say maybe an inverse function or an inverse operation.
Sure.
But this ties nicely back into the idea of composition of functions. So is that something that you can talk about?
Yeah, what I like to do is actually give my students f of g of x and have it equal x, and then g of f of x equal x, and say, is there a meaning behind this? And then go into the definition of what an inverse is.
See, that's good because it ties it into that previous concept of composition that they talked about in the last section, right? And so now we've gotten them to see analytically how we find out what an inverse function is and how it comes to be. But how about graphically, Gabe? What can we do there?
So an activity that I like to do with my students is I like to give them a graph of a function. So just any function, really. And I have them trace the function on trace paper and then reflect it about the line y equals x. So what this does is it'll give us or them an idea as to what the inverse function looks like if there is an inverse function.
Right, okay, I was just going to ask, so if there's not one, then I think we have to kind of point out to them the use of either the vertical line test or the horizontal line test, right? So stress to your students that we could look at the original function and we can use something called the horizontal line test, which will be new for them. They probably haven't seen that before. If they're used to using the vertical line test, they can certainly attempt to find the inverse and then look at that graphically and do the vertical line test for that as well. So what are some of the other things that we want them to think about, Gabe?
I guess one of the big ideas is as they're finding inverses algebraically, something that comes up there is they interchange x and y. And what's nice to point out to your students at that point in time is that step right there is where you're interchanging the domain and the range of f and f inverse. Okay.
And Brittany, the last thing we want them to do is probably work on a couple of these examples, right?
Yes.
Do a couple algebraically, right? Is there any tip maybe that you can give the teachers to help them, and kind of get their students to understand the steps involved in finding an inverse?
Again, with the composition, I like them to see that, and then also, just plugging it in, and your activity actually with the Celsius and Fahrenheit.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned that. So what I like to do sometimes is I'll have my students take out their phones, or if they're using a tablet, they could do that as well in class. And so we'll just look up a temperature here, and the first thing I want to do is on the board I'll give them the equation for Celsius in terms of Fahrenheit. So I'll say, okay, Celsius equals 5/9 times the quantity of Fahrenheit minus 32. And so what they'll do is they'll look up a temperature wherever they want to go. So let's see what we got here. Okay. So let's say if we look up London. Okay. And right now in London it's 81 degrees. Okay. So what I'll have them do is I'll say, okay, well, let's do this. Let's go and find the Celsius temperature for London in terms of 81 degrees. And then after we've done that, let's actually find the inverse of that equation and basically check the math. Make sure that what we saw on our phone is actually correct. So, good, I'm glad. I hope these tips have been helpful and you find much success in section 1.9.